And we're back with Mike St. Louis after a long career with the CDC. I apologize, we're having some technical difficulties, so we're going to go audio only. And we were sort of getting to some very interesting stuff. So I had to ask you about all this, but basically you had to watch what you spent a career on, at least some of it, come undone. Is that how it felt to you?
Yeah, very much so. And so I'd separate two aspects of it. The first was the institution of the CDC, and we part of what I had been. I went there, got my training as a CDC epidemiologist, and I spent most of my career training others, younger scientists, doctors, program workers of various types, and training them to sort of carry out the work that we do. And a lot of that is just embedded in the people and the processes and the ways we undertook our work there at CDC. And again, it was we were very proud of the institution, very proud of what it had accomplished in the past and what it was doing for the American people. And so to see it become so diminished, so punished and shrunken and sort of robbed of that mission in the way that we've seen is really devastating.
Can you give us a sense, Mike, or an example of that devastation, of the extent of it?
Well, there are people who are, I saw someone the other day at a memorial service who was someone who had been a key communicator. He was an influenza expert, somebody I worked with very closely during the times I was pulled into influenza-related work and also during COVID. And he has been an essential cog, meeting with and having gained the trust of many other countries that are likewise essential for our influenza work in the United States. And he was. And I was asking him where he had been recently, and he'd been nowhere. He's not been allowed to travel. He's put in repeated requests for travel to be able to go out and do the sort of work he does, and yet he's been unable to make those essential trips. And so that's someone who hasn't lost their job per se. They're still getting a paycheck, but they've been put in a straitjacket that is not allowing them to have the effect that they would normally have on, again, protection of the world from an influenza outbreak. And so that's one very recent example. But there are many examples, and just people are very CDC is not allowed to publish a lot of its science. It's being overruled by other managers up the line and people who are not scientists and who are not experts. And so the work is being judged by its political content rather than the public health importance and the scientific rigor of the work.
What about
So.
vaccines? I mean, I think that, obviously they're closely identified with Bobby Kennedy Jr. But what I really wonder and would love to hear from you is what is your prediction in terms of vaccines? In other words, there are things we've eradicated. There are things we've reduced to almost eradication. How will the dearth of vaccines affect the public health, in the next 5 to 10 years?
The we can already see with the measles outbreaks that when you have reductions in immunization, you will have outbreaks, and we will. A recent decision was made to stop the policy of vaccinating infants for hepatitis and uniformly sort of vaccinating infants for hepatitis at birth. And that will very predictably lead to renewed cases of viral hepatitis, which will lead to liver cancer, which will lead to death. So the exact timing of when these outbreaks will occur, we don't know, but the diseases are lurking, and they are available somewhere in the world, and diseases travel rapidly, and when we're unprotected, we will see outbreaks of measles and whooping cough and other diseases. The very scary to think that we could drop the ball on the eradication of polio and ultimately end up seeing polio return to the United States.
That would be so tragic. I had a very close friend, my college advisor, actually had polio, was on crutches his whole life and never got off, and that was not unusual in his generation. Mike, I want to ask you one more kind of topical question before I get into your career, and I'm sure people are very interested in all of it. But so the response to COVID was initially and mostly, certainly initially within the first Trump administration. Did you see some of these problems germinating back then? Were you having trouble dealing with the science of it versus the politics of what was happening?
The administration was also very interested in controlling the narrative, and there was a sort of famous episode early on where one of the CDC leaders mentioned that during a briefing that there would be that this was going to be an important epidemic and it was going to change Americans' lives. Needless to say, that came to be true. But the CDC was immediately punished for the allowing that basically fact, that prediction to be uttered by any senior official, and at that point there was restrictions on CDC's ability to communicate, and all the communication had to be going through the White House. So that was a very difficult time. It was at the time there were, errors made all around, and CDC made errors. I think made some important errors during the course of trying to manage COVID, which was, obviously a massive public health challenge. But we had, in my experience, the earlier 40 years, there had never been a time when we were micromanaged, when CDC was micromanaged so much in being able to communicate to the American public what the important scientific information was that we had at that time.
Mike, let's go. Let's get into the Wayback Machine. Back to your time at Harvard. I know it's such an interesting story. And my question is, when you decided you wanted to become a doctor, when did you realize, A, that you wanted to be a doctor, and B, that you wanted to immediately or soon thereafter get into public health policy?
Well, it wasn't completely straightforward. I did I was a biochemistry major, and I quite naturally completed the requirements, the pre-med requirements as part of that. And I think, going to medical school was one of the options, but I was really had I was not dedicated and a dedicated pre-med from the beginning. I was actually came to Harvard initially on the basis of being very interested in animal behavior. And
No kidding.
I had read a lot about B.F. Skinner, and I actually had undertaken experiments when I was in high school. I was got very involved in trying to train rats to do various complicated procedures, and had really gotten quite into that sphere. And so I thought that was where I would end up ultimately working in behavioral psychology and so on. But I find myself getting drawn into biochemistry and then chemistry and physics when I was at Harvard. But also into social sciences. And one of the my some of my closest friends were mostly in social sciences, and so I actually wasn't sure, didn't apply to medical school out of college. Actually, it was had a fellowship year, the Finley Fellowship, named for John Finley from Eliot House.
Yeah.
And I'm sorry, I was going to mention I was got a little bit of a fellowship junkie there. I sort of got a Mackenzie King as well when I graduated from college, and went to Canada to study economics for a year, and thought about going into economics and going into development economics in particular. At that point, interested in the issues of global poverty, and yet somehow I wasn't sure what to do, and decided to apply to medical school. Applied to just one medical school, and ended up getting in, and then finally I think I just lost my nerve about it was too hard to decide, so I ultimately decided to just go to medical school, because that was at that point that became the easiest pathway forward. So the Mackenzie King, I studied economics. The Finley Fellowship was for a summer, and for a summer of activity to enrich my experience at Harvard. And I took the opportunity to go down to work on a shrimp boat in Bayou Lafourche, Louisiana, and spend the summer doing that. And so that was really a great life expanding experience, working on a shrimp boat. Right. No, I was from Connecticut, so that was really getting to a different part of the country, and a different type of life. But it was very eye opening, and really fun. I was from Groton, Connecticut. Groton is near New London and Mystic. Well, my father was a chemical engineer. He was a first generation college student, and he went to college, and saw, I think, had the experience that 4 years of college was the most you could do as most he would have expected to do. And he learned that chemical engineering was made for had a good remuneration, and so he chose that. So he was a scientifically oriented person and became an engineer. And he worked at Pfizer, the pharmaceutical manufacturer that was in Connecticut. I did, yeah. Well, I think I could have stayed in economics, and I was invited to stay at McGill, where I had been studying for my year, and to continue on in training toward a PhD in economics. And so that would have been, I could also have applied somewhere else, but the easy things at hand were, one, to go back to Harvard and go to medical school, or to stay in Canada and study economics. And like I say, it was the it was a bit of a flip of a coin. I was interested in many things, and I was found it very challenging to decide between things. And ultimately, sort of, I think the time came to make a commitment to go to medical school or not, and I decided to go. Once I got there, medical school is a that there's a lot of work in medical school, but I tried very hard to keep to continue reading and in a variety of fields, and to be open to friendships and activities that gave me a little bit of a life of the mind beyond just medical school.
Given your broader scope, and looking at medicine, looking at public health, what obviously there was the opportunity to impact people, but what was the most interesting thing about it to you? Sort of the human or the politics of it, or was it more the science of it, or was it a place where you could really do both?
Well, I would say it was all of that. Medicine turns out to be, I mean, there is fascinating science, and there's actually also, even, I had during when I was an undergraduate, I spent a couple of summers building houses up in Maine. Got very involved in carpentry and furniture making, and ultimately, and so on. Um, and and so, I mean, and I mention that only to say that one of the fields, surgery was very attractive. I mean, I came to another, node point when I had to decide which specialty to go into, and by that point, my interest in, the combination of economics and dealing with, global poverty, and being in medicine led me to think about global health, and that turned out to be the direction I went. But a near second was actually to go into surgery, because I found myself very attracted by the sort of the intensity of working, of a surgical procedure, the precision one needed to have. I particularly liked orthopedics because it had a lot of that functional, sort of carpentry-like aspect of putting something together to make it work, and have it have a person go out and be turned from, disabled in some fashion, at least temporarily, to being, re-enabled to be mobile or be active. But ultimately decided that I would go with the global health perspective, and orientation, and then thus I chose pediatrics, which is a pretty natural field for someone interested in global health, since the care of children and the health of small children is such a big part of global health.
So what did you do? Did you go directly to the CDC from after you became an MD?
Well, no, I did a residency. So I did 3 years actually stayed in the Harvard system. I was at Mass General Hospital for 3 years in pediatrics. They actually had a name for somebody, at Mass General in the residency, if you had been to Harvard College and Harvard Medical School, and then you again went for the third round at MGH. They called you Preparation H. That was sort of my nickname.
Yeah, so you did preparation.
So
I sense with you that like you're the kind of person who probably would have been happy in a lot of different places. That you're not, status oriented like many others. I suppose like myself, and that wasn't what mattered to you, but what mattered was what you were learning. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, that's a fair statement. I would say, it makes, I don't, I would say also that, at a time when I'm making hard decisions about, going to the left or right, I can get a little wobbly. And so once I was in the Harvard system, it's sort of, I hate to admit it, but in some ways the easiest thing to do is just to stay at Harvard. So that was part of it as well. So
Yeah, yeah. And after your residency, what happened then?
so actually during my residency, I got another fellowship, which opportunity to the Henry Luce Fellowship. That provided sort of young Americans with a year of work in Asia. And so, after 2 years of pediatrics residency is 3 years. After 2 years, I actually took a year off, and when I got the Luce Fellowship, and went to Indonesia to actually do global health, and that was a terrific year. It was an amazing experience to be able to go to a rural area. I was in Banda Aceh, which a number of years later became famous for the terrible tsunami that hit and devastated that area of Aceh province. But anyway, I had a wonderful year there, wonderful mentors, and had an opportunity to really learn the sort of nuts and bolts of sort of how children, get sick and die, and how children can be better protected in these kind of rural, developing country settings, and learned that very well, and had a wonderful experience, appreciating the culture of Indonesia as well. So that was a great experience. I went back. Then I went back and finished my residency. It was actually in Indonesia when I heard about the Epidemic Intelligence Service, which is the disease detective program at the CDC. And so I came back to the U.S. and applied to that, and got in there, and I've been here in Atlanta ever since.
Wow. And what did you learn in Indonesia about children's health in particular that you kind of carried forward from there?
Well, I think I think it was really sort of the outlook of mothers taking care of children in that sort of environment, and for people with limited education, trying to have them to understand the programs that allowed them to be able to participate fully and to trust the system. There's a lot of you're always dealing with issues of trust and mistrust. In Indonesia, there was that population, the area that I lived in was considered a breakaway. Had multiple times tried to break away from the rest of Indonesia, and so there was a certain tension with the government authorities, and just being able to see how to design and deliver health programs, basic health programs, immunization, growth charting, feeding programs, to be able to do that in ways that built trust was essential. And of course, now you boomerangs back to our situation in the United States, where distrust of institutions, distrust of government, one or the other, is causing us tremendous chaos and really limiting the ability, our ability to be in a position to react if we were to have another major epidemic.
What was your first job at the CDC?
I was, I was in the Epidemic Intelligence Service. That's the group that does outbreaks, and I was barely at CDC, and through the first 3 weeks of training, when I got notified that there was an outbreak of botulism out in Vancouver, British Columbia, and I managed to. So I got on a plane and went out and investigated that outbreak. It was turned out to be the largest outbreak at that time that had ever been seen in North America. And so I investigated. We found the cause, and we were able to stop the epidemic and find actually a large number of patients who had been missed, who actually had the botulism disease, but who had been misdiagnosed with anything from psychiatric disease to depression, to suspected cancer, and were not getting the therapy that they needed because they'd been misdiagnosed.
Were you married by this time, Mike?
I was not married at that time.
Okay.
I finished I was there for 3 weeks and was debriefing by telephone and getting ready to come home when I was told that there was an outbreak of bacteria of antibiotic resistant salmonella in the Los Angeles area in Southern California, and did I want to go there? And so I said sure, and so I went there and spent 6 weeks in Los Angeles, driving around, going to everywhere from we sort of determined that it was associated with hamburgers at fast food joints, and so but I got involved in tracing the hamburger back, and successfully tracing it all the way back to the farms, and we were able to show that that antibiotics had been were being fed to cattle. The cattle were developing these antibiotic resistant strains of salmonella, and that salmonella was persisting in the hamburger all the way through to making people sick. So that was the type of investigation what we did, try to do thorough investigations that would lead us to be able to recommend preventive action for the future.
And I'm struck by sort of the exciting nature of this. It almost reminds me of firefighters or people, even pardon the comparison, but the SEAL Team 6 or something like that, where something terrible happens, and you're the first people that go in there. Is that what you would do for much of your career? Was it that kind of an experience?
Well, there's a 2-year program of the Epidemic Intelligence Service, and they're the ones who. So I did that for 2 years. I actually had one of the highest number of outbreaks investigated at CDC.
Wow.
among all the cohorts of EIS officers. I was always ready to go,
Yeah.
and wasn't married, was not married at that time. So I was ready to go and eager to involve, be involved in these different outbreaks. It was very exciting. It's sometimes, you're also going into a place where there's unknown disease and you're potentially at risk. One of my outbreaks that I worked on was a cholera outbreak in West Africa, and I went there and actually got extremely sick and very nearly. I mean, people very I had a temperature of 106, and I had
Oh my God.
bleeding under my skin and my legs. It looked like a case of hemorrhagic fever, and I think it was probably a severe case of malaria that because I did get treated for malaria and got better. Actually, after my experience with that, CDC started started giving us SOS cards so we could get on air ambulances if we needed to. But so I, but the bottom line is you're going into a setting of danger. You are bearing, expert knowledge. You're going in with, sort of the tip of the spear to a public health emergency.
Yeah.
And so yes, it is. I mean, it's our equivalent. It's not, I don't want to, steal, the valor from, the Navy SEALs and other groups that are really in life, saving and life threatening circumstance. But yeah, you're involved. It is exciting, and it concentrates the mind. That you
I would think so. No, that's really something. And did you? We need to talk about, of course, HIV/AIDS and your role in containing that, because this was it the most important thing in your career, and how did that come about?
Well, I took care of, during my residency when I was at Mass General, I took care of, I spoke French, and so I took care of the French-speaking patients. And there was a little girl from Haiti who turned out to be one of the first diagnosed cases of what we now call AIDS back at that time. And was very attached to this little girl, and she lived for about 6 weeks
Oh wow.
in a hospital bed as she gradually got worse. But a very special child, and I really became sort of committed to trying to work on AIDS in poor countries like Haiti, and
What
so.
could I stop you just to ask, what were you? Okay, so this is before it's even been diagnosed. What did you think you were seeing?
We've, there was I'm going to blank, I may blank up, there was, at the time, there was this syndrome of immunodeficiency, acquired immunodeficiency. And, there were a set of risk groups that were defined, that were used for surveillance. And the risk groups included hemophiliacs, people who got included homosexuals, included IV drug users, and included Haitians. And that was, that was the early, there was no blood test at that point. There was no diagnostic test, although we were gradually learning. And in this little girl, we were able to test for the loss of T cells, T lymphocytes,
Uh-huh.
which is a characteristic back in the day before we had a test, and before we knew this was infectious disease for sure. So we were hypothesizing that it might be infectious, but yeah. So so this girl came in with the syndrome of immunodeficiency and had pneumocystis. Carinine pneumonia, and various other infections.
And were you when was the moment you realized it was more than just a one-off or a isolated cases? Was there a moment you remember of just sitting there and going, "Oh my God, this is going to be bad"?
Well, I think that was dawning on everyone by that point, and so in this particular case, when I took care of this child, it was just we were just still learning that there were children other than hemophiliacs who were being infected, and there were just very few of them. So. Yeah, it was. I think it was fairly obvious at that point that there was going to be more, and we started to. The early rumblings then started for about AIDS in Africa, and that which sort of led to the rest of my career.
And tell us about that. So you ended up going to Africa and kind of fighting it directly.
Well, I took care of that little girl as part of my residency. I later went to CDC. When I was at CDC, the disease outbreak training that I did, or the 2 years of fellowship, I did actually in a field called enteric diseases, bacterial enteric diseases, diseases of the gut, mostly diarrheal diseases and so on. And I did that simply because that was a good, gave the most opportunity to do outbreak investigations of the sort that I did. But then after that, as soon as that was finished, I went into HIV, and HIV, we were just at the stage of having a blood test that was useful, and so my first work after that period was setting up studies around the United States to determine the extent and the range and distribution of HIV infections in this country. As I built that experience up, I was also, again, paying attention to what was happening, the news that was happening from Africa, and where, a number of countries were showing, much higher levels of infection, and infections that were outside of that group, the risk groups that were most prominently infected in the United States. In the United States, again, it turned out to be mostly an epidemic of homosexual men and of injection drug users. But in Africa, it seemed like there was heterosexual transmission was a very important part of the epidemic. And so my next adventure was to apply for and get a position as the lead epidemiologist at CDC's project in Zaire, then called Zaire, in Kinshasa, which was now called Democratic Republic of Congo. And so I went there, and we worked on a large number of studies. There was a big research program going on there with multiple academic and other partners. NIH was with us and others, and we had so we were really studying especially the transmission of AIDS heterosexually. Was a main focus, and also the mother-to-child transmission, which was since so many more women were infected in Africa.
And by this time, did you have a family? Were you married?
Actually, when I look back on it, I sort of shake my head. But when I moved to Africa, I was married, had a 2-year-old and a 7-week-old. Baby that we took along to Kinshasa, Zaire, it was anyway. It was pretty crazy, but it was a wonderful work environment. It was not. It was a difficult place to live, and it was very expensive, difficult. There was not a lot of recreation activity, opportunities, and that sort of thing there. But it was, but the work was, we got a lot of important work done. I was only there for about a year though, because there was as happens periodically in Zaire, there was a mutiny. The soldiers didn't get paid, and there was an uprising of the soldiers. There was quite a substantial uprising, and we were hunkered down in our compound for 3 or 4 days that were pretty scary, with a lot of, automatic, automatic rifle fire, going on around us. Mostly in the air. Mostly, it was not. We were not really directly threatened.
Well, Mike, you have had
Anyway,
such an adventure. You used the word adventure. I think such an adventurous life. I have to apologize because we're running out of time, and we have just scratched the surface of what you did at the CDC. But I did, we have this odd phenomenon of having the Secretary of Health and Human Services in our class, and I'm wondering, A, if you ever spoke with him or met him either at Harvard or since, and if in either case, if you could talk to him now, if you could get his ear now, what you would tell him.
well, I am. So I don't know him. I haven't met him before. He's obviously had an important career, and has passions for health of the population. And I am, to be honest, uh, I'm not sure that there is anything that I would be in a position to say that would be meaningful, or would be influential to someone in his position. That he's already sort of set his sail, and determined his the orientation that he has. And
Yeah.
that orientation unfortunately has included a low regard for people and institutions for which I have tremendous regard. And I suppose I would just try to reiterate that how impressed I was my entire career with an institution that definitely had good intentions, and was full of smart people who were really dedicated public servants. And they could be useful to any Secretary of Health if it really wanted to mobilize and put them to work to achieve better health for the American people.
Did you work with Dr. Anthony Fauci?
I did. He was part of the collaboration in Zaire that I mentioned. And it was quite an illustrious group. But Tony Fauci is, a brilliant scientist, and again, dedicated public servant. And also, made, like all of us, made mistakes at time and errors in judgment, and sort of had suboptimal communication and so on. So nobody's perfect, but yes, I knew him. I knew him pretty well, and he's a remarkable public servant who has been a giant in public health in the United States.
How did you feel about what happened to him? The criticism, even having to worry about his own security.
I just
Prosecute.
it's mind-boggling to me. It's mind-boggling that someone who was, who's worked so closely with so many presidents, and worked especially closely with, and worked, across the aisle with both parties, and worked especially closely with George W. Bush in the design and setup of the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, or PEPFAR, which many people think is one of the greatest achievements, certainly in global health, that the United States has ever completed, along with elimination of smallpox. It's very it's mind-boggling to see a public servant like that be subjected to the type of treatment and insecurity that he is.
I know there's been a lot of bad news in this podcast, but and it's tragic, and it's really in the case of public health, it's tragic because people are going to get sick and people are going to die, and it's going to have direct impact, and probably already has. There's certainly evidence of that with the measles outbreak and other things. But Mike, I want to speak for my classmates and say, and I'm going to turn my camera back on, just say, how proud I am personally of what you accomplished and how you dedicated your life to the public good, really, without reservation. And something, I think there's a strain of that in our class. I've done I haven't counted how many of these I've done, but it's really notable that that people serve in their town as a mayor, like my friend John Kiernan, or served on the planning board like my friend Fred Cowett, and I'm sort of seeing that pattern that they're, for whatever reasons, maybe because we really are children of the 60s, I don't know, we sort of embodied that, and I think honestly none more so than you. I mean, 40 years is a long time, putting yourself at risk, and so thank you for everything, and I hope are we going to see you at reunion?
Yes, I plan to be there. So I look forward to it.
Okay, we're having our technical problems again, but Mike, I want to say thanks, and I look forward to catching up in real time. So thanks for doing
Okay,
that.
I'll see you at the reunion. Yeah.
Okay,
Mike.
take care. Bye bye.
Thank you. Bye.